Welcome to Trust Talk. Few people stand closer to the crossroads of politics and justice than prosecutors. Dan Richman, former federal prosecutor and now professor at Columbia Law School, joins Trust Talk to explain why public trust is both their greatest asset and their greatest vulnerability. Dan explains how prosecutors serve a uniquely sensitive role in a democracy. They are instruments for building public trust, yet at the same time dependent on that very trust to do their work. When political influence shapes prosecutorial decisions, who gets charged, who doesn't, and why, the credibility of the entire justice system is at risk. Drawing on his New York Times op-ed, Richman reflects on how credibility eroded during the Trump administration, when prosecutors and FBI agents were fired for political reasons and courtroom candor gave way to partisanship. He also explores how prosecutions shape citizens' sense of fairness, why transparency remains limited, and how accountability can be safeguarded without politicizing justice. This conversation underscores why prosecutorial integrity is central to maintaining trust in the rule of law. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Dan, welcome to Trust Talk. I first reached out to you after reading your New York Times op-ed, "Is Discovering the Downside of a Justice Department with No Credibility." That piece caught my attention because it spoke to how fragile trust in institutions can be. In your broader work, you describe prosecutors as having a special role in a democracy, not just enforcing laws, but shaping how people experience justice. I hear you say that political influence can really damage prosecutorial credibility. From your perspective, how does politics get in the way of prosecutors doing their job? And what could help restore that credibility?
So what's interesting about prosecutors is they are both an instrument for promoting public trust, and their work depends upon public trust. If you look at the purposes of criminal law more generally, particularly if you draw on sociologists like Durkheim, they say, well, we're not exactly sure that prosecuting people deters others from committing crimes, but what its real audience is the public, and sending a message that enhances social cohesion, that basically says the state will be there to go after those who behave poorly. And that promotes, to the extent the citizens believe that promotes trust among citizens. Even if you don't accept that theory, in general, prosecutors are a critical instrument for holding others accountable. The social perception that somebody is being accountable really depends on the public trusting the accuracy and fairness of the work. In the United States, at least, prosecutors play a defining role in this accountability process.
We come to that aspect. In that op-ed, you warned about what happens when the Justice Department loses credibility. What did you see happening there, and why does credibility matter so much for trust?
Well, even before you're in front of the jury, there's the question of, are people being charged for the right reasons? In the United States, the public knows very little about who's not prosecuted, and very little about even why those who are prosecuted. Perceptions about whether that was done in a fair way that's based on the facts and the law and some grander sense of public interest depends on trusting prosecutors to be acting not as minions of the president or for some political reason, but trying to do the right thing. And yes, they're humans and they often get it wrong, and institutions are fallible, but to the extent possible, you really want a world in which when a prosecutor stands up, she's thought to be acting on the basis of the law, the facts, and the public interest. And one of the things we've seen under the Trump administration is a real erosion of that credibility through a number of things that have happened. One is Prosecutors are being fired for lack of loyalty to the president, whatever that means. Agents in the FBI are being pushed out because of associations with enemies of the administration. Prosecutors are standing in front of judges and either lying in some cases or being unable to give accurate, factual answers to questions because they've been denied access to the information. So at every turn, you really see increasingly, and obviously the system hasn't fallen to the ground yet, but each week brings another piece of evidence of the administration trying to turn what is intended and to some extent was an independent thinking organ of government into just a personal tool of the president.
You just mentioned that prosecutors, through the choices they make, what cases to bring and which one to let go, really shape how people experience justice. How do those choices affect people's trust in the system?
Prosecutors, or the cases that are brought, say a lot about what kind of conduct the government is seeking to condemn loudly. If prosecutors are starting to be seen by the citizens as just those exercising the president's power, convictions aren't a tool of social cohesion or public accountability. They're just a matter of naked power that is totally contestable because you don't trust the presentation of the facts and you don't trust the calculus that went into them. Another way that people's trust in the system is eroded is, particularly in the federal system, one of the hallmarks of the system, and it's not reliable, but it's always been there, is to go after those with power, whether illegitimate power or public power, who abuse it. And I think the sense that corruption cases are not being pursued, that cases against privileged people, particularly if they're friends of the administration, are not being pursued, start to reduce the notion that the system is being fair and that cases are being brought based on the facts, the law, and the public interest.
Prosecutors have a lot of discretion, you just mentioned it, but they also need to be accountable. How do they think they can strike that balance, building trust while still being held responsible for their choices?
It is a strange thing, I think, for those outside the United States to recognize that most of our prosecutors at the state level are elected. And even at the federal level, where they're not elected, the chief prosecutor in each district is appointed by the president and very much connected to the party in power. Somehow, the hope is there is some degree of insulation between the political operations of parties and of leaders and line prosecutors. If the thought is that line prosecutors, when they look at particular cases, are thinking in political terms, then you really have a sense that the system has gone awry. So you need accountability at the top in terms of choosing cases. You also need accountability in how cases are handled, but that accountability needs to be filtered through a far less political mechanism than we're seeing.
You've written about how prosecutors build narratives around cases, what you've called framing the prosecution. How do those stories shape people's sense of fairness and their trust in the system?
It's always going to be hard to figure out what happened in the past, whether you're a historian or a prosecutor, particularly when evidence is fragmented or incomplete. Whenever anyone tries to create the past, they generally are going to draw on some sort of narrative and construct a narrative that tries to make sense of what they've seen. Over and beyond that process of just trying to recreate the past in one person's mind, for prosecutors is the need to construct a narrative that makes sense to others. Particularly if you're trying to bring a case, you need to tell a story about culpability, a story that makes people think not just that some technical rule has been violated, but that this person deserves to have serious criminal sanctions imposed on. So you're going to draw on stereotypes, sometimes really regrettably. And one of the concerns that we should always have is that the stereotypes and stories that prosecutors construct are neither rooted in fact or adequately rooted in fact, and are just dangerous as a matter of perpetuating stereotypes that really lead to mistreatment of others in society. So how prosecutors construct these stories and the stories they use very much affect people's sense of fairness and their trust, particularly if they see those stories lack basis or those stories are offensive.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you are saying that political influence can really damage prosecutorial credibility. From your perspective, how does politics get in the way of prosecutors doing their job, and what could help restore that credibility?
As I said, particularly in the United States, where we elect our prosecutors at most levels, and where even in the federal system, their politics is involved in the choice of chief prosecutors. What needs to be done is not to, or at least for now, we're not going to have a radical reform, is even if we don't change that system, and I'm not saying we even should, we need to somehow construct institutional protections so that line prosecutors aren't seen as just carrying water for the president. What needs to be done in the future, and hopefully will be done after the Trump administration or even later on, is to build up the culture of the offices, to build up the insulation of offices from political interference so that juries, judges, and citizenry at large don't see prosecutors as just agents of the president.
People often say transparency is key to building trust. What kind of transparency in prosecutorial decisions do you think is actually realistic? And would it make a difference for public confidence?
Full transparency is going to be hard, if not impossible, in the criminal system. You can't talk about cases you're not pursuing because there are privacy concerns and fairness concerns. And often you can't even explain why cases are brought or not brought. But to do their job, prosecutors have to work with all sorts of institutions, whether juries, judges, police, local officials, who can stand in to some extent for the public at large, and will get a sense, one hopes, of the quality of the work and the legitimacy of the work prosecutors are done. I think of this as sort of a network accountability. It's working within a network of institutions. Prosecutors really can and should be held to an obligation to explain their work to those particular institutions at a level of adequacy for those institutions, whether you're in front of a jury or dealing with local police and the like. I also think prosecutors have to explain their work better generally. One of the mantras you often hear from prosecutors, particularly, old school prosecutors, is we only explain our work in public filings and nothing more. And then they'll add, and we bring all cases when the facts and the law support them. Well, that's not true. We know that public interest determinations are often considered and sometimes require not bringing cases where the facts and the law support bringing a case. So prosecutors have to the extent possible, lean a little more forward in explaining their actions, because we are now moved to a world where legitimacy of government institutions generally is sorely being tested. And I don't think prosecutors can hide from scrutiny in the way they've been able to do in the past.
Looking more broadly, what role can legal scholars, practitioners, even the media play in rebuilding credibility in the justice system?
I think the greatest contribution all of these actors can make is to get beyond generalizations and to ask questions about particular cases and particular offices. All too often you hear people talk in general about the police or prosecutors generally. And for sociologists, I see the value sometimes, but when you want to hold institutions accountable, you need to be focused at an institutional level. And in the United States, that means not prosecutors in general, but a department in the Justice Department or particular offices within that department or police forces or agencies. The more granular you are in your selection of institutions to analyze, the more probing your questions can be. You can draw on facts, you can draw on empirical work, qualitative or quantitative, and really put these institutions on notice that what they do is going to be questioned in a very particularized way rather than just being subject to broad rhetoric.
If we step outside the courtroom for a moment, do the lessons about trust in prosecution also apply to other institutions like the police or government agencies?
Everything I've said about prosecutors applies to police. Police and prosecutors work hand in hand, and one can't be held accountable without thinking about the accountability of the other. And if there's no trust in the police, what prosecutors are doing is just doing some work with a product that lacks credibility. So certainly when it comes to the police, but really for all government institutions, I think particularly in a time when information is either scarce or false or just generalizations are bandied around on social media, clear information, credibility presented as often as possible is going to be the key for government institutions to start regaining the trust that they've been losing across the board. And obviously that's not enough, but it certainly is a really important starting place.
In many European countries, judges play a much more active role in investigations, the inquisitorial system. Do you think that kind of model makes it easier or harder to build public trust compared to the adversarial system in the United States?
I think one of the big ironies of the American system is that it is based on some foundational choices that reflect the concern that people won't trust the state or shouldn't trust the state. Our use of juries instead of judges as fact finders. Our reliance on an adversarial process, both for evidence collection and fact development in front of a jury, reflects a desire to move away from a world in which state actors control the process. And the huge irony, of course, is that in the shadow of those foundational choices has developed a world in which prosecutors are left with considerable discretion and are able to use enormous powers that are rather unregulated in a way that's quite different from what you see in continental systems. So when it comes to the inquisitorial system, the trust that individuals will have in that system is very much going to be related to the trust they have in the state more generally. So if you have a state that is not trusted by its populace, an inquisitorial system is not going to do very much good in the way of getting people to appreciate and respect its results. It will just be yet another organ of a corrupt state. If you have a state that's trusted, then an inquisitorial system works quite well at some level in just being a bureaucracy that does its work as part of many other state bureaucracies. So I think you could think of inquisitorial systems and a non-adversarial system as being a steady bureaucratic extension of the state for good or for ill. The American system, which isn't just accusatory in the sense of an adversary process, but it involves, at least when we have trials, juries, not judges, is higher variance. In other words, our system, based on this lack of trust in the state, can, if it's working well, do quite a good job in promoting trust because we have more citizen participation than in an inquisitorial system. You can see that in Japan, where there is concern about the legitimacy of their judge-run process, they introduce lay jurors into their panels. Citizen participation can at least potentially be a vehicle for promoting public trust and legitimacy. Now, that said, it's high variance in the sense that defense lawyers cannot do their job well, prosecutors can be poorly motivated or just lazy or subject to political influence. So I say it's high variance in that it's capable of, at its best, of being very good at promoting public trust, and at its worst, being far inferior to a state-run bureaucracy.
Dan, we have come to the end of our conversation. Thanks so much for sharing your insights. You've given us a lot to think about when it comes to prosecutors, credibility, and the fragile but essential role of trust in justice. Thank you very much for being our guest today and wishing you all the best. By the way, are you still practicing the prosecutor job, or are you now solely at the university?
I haven't been a real-life prosecutor since 1992.
Oh.
People in there, although I've had some government involvement since then.
Okay, I wish you all the best. Thanks for being our guest today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the chance to talk.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Trust Talk. We hope today's conversation inspired new insights into the transformative power of trust. At Trust Talk, we're committed to exploring trust's role in shaping a better world, one story at a time. If our mission resonates with you, we invite you to support us. Your donation, no matter the size, helps us continue these meaningful conversations. Visit us at trusttalk.co/donate to contribute and be part of this journey. Thank you for listening and being part of the Trust Talk community. We can't wait to have you join us again for the next episode.